A Wendigo Tale. Introduction: the creeping fear. Hunger of the forest. The forest was alive, not with birds or the rustle of small creatures, but with something darker, older. The kind of presence that hung in the air like a suffocating fog, wrapping itself around your very soul. No one dared speak of it aloud, and no one who entered the heart of these woods came back unchanged. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to make the wrong move. You could hear the wind, but it didn't sound like any wind you'd ever known. It was almost like it was trying to speak, low, guttural sounds, a faint whisper that only you could hear. It twisted through the trees, growing louder, angrier as you ventured deeper. The snow beneath your boots crunched, but there was something unnerving about the way it echoed in the distance, as if the forest was repeating your every step, mocking you, daring you to turn back. The trees were unnaturally still, their branches like gnarled fingers reaching out, ready to grab you if you weren't paying attention. Every corner, every shadow seemed to shift and stretch, playing tricks on your eyes. And then you felt it. That sensation, the hair on the back of your neck rising, the skin on your arms prickling, the unmistakable feeling that you were being watched. But by what? You turned, half expecting to see someone or something following you. And then you remembered the warnings, the local legends about the Wendigo, an entity so cursed it consumed more than just flesh. It consumed the very soul of those who dared wander into its domain. They said its shadow stretched for miles, hunting, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. But you weren't afraid. Not yet. The storm was coming. Or was it? The wind howled, and the air grew colder, colder than anything you'd ever felt before. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The shadow of something massive moved just out of view, like a predator circling its prey. And in that very moment you understood this wasn't a myth. It was a warning that you were far deeper into this cursed land than you'd ever intended to be. In the heart of an endless frozen wilderness, where the snow never truly ends, and the silence feels like it has lived for centuries, there exists a forest like no other. It's a land untouched by time, where the sun dares only to skim the horizon, casting a pale, eerie glow over the land. The trees, ancient and twisted, loom like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers, grabbing at the very air itself. The wind doesn't whistle here. It howls with a deep, guttural voice, carrying a sense of foreboding, as if it's warning you to turn back before it's too late. But there's nowhere to run. The wilderness traps you in its cold embrace, a cold that isn't just a chill on your skin. It sinks deep into your bones, a living thing, an entity of its own. It creeps into your very thoughts, whispering in your ear, feeding on your doubt, urging you to wander deeper into the forest. And as the sky grows darker, the shadows stretch and twist in unnatural ways, hiding secrets that you weren't meant to uncover. Here, in the heart of this forsaken place, you are not alone. Something watches from the shadows. Its eyes never blink, its presence so suffocating that even the air feels heavier, as though the very forest is holding its breath. You feel it before you see it, the primal, unrelenting hunger that claws at the back of your mind, urging you to flee, but you can't move. You can only stand there, frozen by a fear so deep it feels like the very earth beneath your feet might swallow you whole. The forest knows your name. The trees whisper it on the wind. The Wendigo is near, and once it senses you, there is no escaping its grasp. The shadow of the creature looms, growing closer, its figure taking shape in the corner of your vision, always just out of reach, but never far enough to be forgotten. Every step you take, the air grows colder, the darkness grows thicker, and the feeling of being hunted becomes all too real. This is a place where the very fabric of reality begins to unravel. The deeper you go, the more the world outside seems like a distant memory. And as you journey further, you begin to wonder, is the Wendigo chasing you, or is it simply waiting for you to come closer, step by step, until it's too late? In the heart of an endless, frozen wilderness, where the snow never truly ends, and the silence feels like it has lived for centuries, there exists a forest like no other. It's a land untouched by time, where the sun dares only to skim the horizon, casting a pale, eerie glow over the land. The trees, ancient and twisted, loom like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like fingers, grabbing at the very air itself. The wind doesn't whistle here. It howls with a deep, guttural voice, carrying a sense of foreboding, as if it's warning you to turn back before it's too late. But there's nowhere to run. The wilderness traps you in its cold embrace, a cold that isn't just a chill on your skin, it sinks deep into your bones, a living thing, an entity of its own. It creeps into your very thoughts, whispering in your ear, feeding on your doubt, urging you to wander deeper into the forest. And as the sky grows darker, the shadows stretch and twist in unnatural ways, hiding secrets that you weren't meant to uncover. Here, in the heart of this forsaken place, you are not alone. Something watches from the shadows. Its eyes never blink, its presence so suffocating that even the air feels heavier, as though the very forest is holding its breath. You feel it before you see it, the primal, unrelenting hunger that claws at the back of your mind, urging you to flee. But you can't move. You can only stand there, frozen by a fear so deep it feels like the very earth beneath your feet might swallow you whole. The forest knows your name. The trees whisper it on the wind. The Wendigo is near. And once it senses you, there is no escaping its grasp. The shadow of the creature looms, growing closer, its figure taking shape in the corner of your vision. Always just out of reach, but never far enough to be forgotten. Every step you take, the air grows colder, the darkness grows thicker, and the feeling of being hunted becomes all too real. This is a place where the very fabric of reality begins to unravel. The deeper you go, the more the world outside seems like a distant memory. And as you journey further, you begin to wonder, is the Wendigo chasing you? Or is it simply waiting for you to come closer, step by step, until it's too late? The screen fades in slowly, revealing a forest draped in shadows. The trees stand like silent guardians, their twisted branches clawing at the air, as if trying to escape the suffocating fog that curls around their bases. The camera glides low, brushing past the frost-covered ground, where each step seems to echo with a hollow, unnatural sound. The silence isn't peaceful. It's heavy, charged, like the forest is holding its breath. A faint whisper carries on the wind, a voice too soft to understand, yet too haunting to ignore. And then, out of nowhere, a sound, a crack, sharp and loud, like a branch snapping underfoot. The camera freezes, panning toward the darkness between the trees, where something, or someone, might be watching. But nothing moves. The fog thickens, wrapping tighter around the trees, and the camera focuses on the shadows that seem to shift unnaturally. The voice of the protagonist breaks the silence, low and trembling. "Did you hear that?" A pause. No answer. The voice comes again, this time with forced calm, but dripping with fear. "We shouldn't be here." The tension is palpable, and even the audience can feel it now, the eerie sense that they're being watched, hunted, by something far more dangerous than the dark itself. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily muttered, her voice barely audible over the crunch of snow beneath her boots. She tightened her scarf against the biting wind, her eyes scanning the endless stretch of dark, twisted trees around her. The forest was silent, too silent, and that silence was starting to weigh on her nerves, but she couldn't stop now. She had come too far. "You knew what you were getting into," she whispered to herself, clutching her journal tightly to her chest. The old leather cover was scuffed and worn, stuffed with hastily scribbled notes and sketches of legends passed down by locals who refused to step foot into these woods. The Wendigo, the beast of endless hunger, the spirit that hunted the desperate and the lost. "If I find proof, I'll finally have answers," she said, her voice louder now, as if she needed to hear it to believe it herself. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she wanted those answers. The stories had been unsettling enough. The shadowy figure that haunted travelers, the whispers in the wind, the disappearances no one could explain. And yet, here she was, trekking deeper into a place where the line between myth and reality blurred. A sudden snap of a branch nearby made her freeze in her tracks. Her breath caught, forming clouds of white mist in the icy air. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. No answer, just the slow creak of a tree swaying in the wind. Or was it the wind? Emily shook her head, forcing herself to move forward. "Come on, get a grip," she muttered. But as she stepped deeper into the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The weight of the legends felt heavier now, almost tangible, pressing against her chest. Her fingers brushed against the strap of her backpack, where her camera was tucked away. "If this thing is real," she whispered, "I'm going to find it, or it's going to find me." Her breath hitched at her own words, the cold air stinging her lungs. But she didn't turn back. She couldn't. She had to know. What the hell was that? Emily froze mid-step, her breath hanging in the icy air like a ghost. The sound had been faint, almost too faint to catch, like a whisper carried on a dying breeze. She scanned the shadows ahead, the forest eerily still, as if it too was waiting. "It's nothing," she told herself, forcing a nervous laugh that felt hollow even to her own ears. But her heart was racing now, pounding loud enough that it drowned out the silence. She adjusted the strap of her backpack and shook her head. "You're just imagining things. Come on, Emily, focus." But the forest didn't let her focus. Another sound, a low, guttural growl, rumbled somewhere behind her, so deep it was almost inaudible, like the earth itself was groaning. Her body tensed. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the fog, thicker than before, curling around the bases of the ancient trees like claws. "Great," she muttered, more to herself than anything else. "Just a stupid animal, probably a wolf, or something." The hesitation in her voice betrayed her bravado. She tightened her grip on her flashlight, which suddenly felt too small, too useless against the suffocating darkness that pressed in around her. Out of the corner of her eye, a shadow darted, quick, too quick to be natural. She whipped her head toward it, her flashlight trembling in her hand as the beam cut through the mist. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the trees. "Okay, this is getting weird," she whispered, her voice barely audible over her ragged breathing. The logical part of her brain screamed for her to turn back, to get out while she still could. But the stubborn, curious part of her, the part that had brought her here in the first place, pushed her forward. "It's just the wind," she said aloud, trying to convince herself. Her voice echoed back at her in the stillness, sounding small and uncertain. Just the wind, nothing else. But deep down, Emily knew better. The forest didn't feel empty anymore. It felt alive, watching, waiting. She swallowed hard and tightened her scarf, forcing her legs to move forward, even as every instinct in her body screamed for her to run. And then, just as she took another step, she heard it again, the whisper. This time it was clearer, almost human, but wrong. The sound slithered through the trees, brushing against her ears like a cold hand. It sent a chill down her spine, so sharp it almost hurt. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice breaking. No answer. Just the sound of her own rapid breathing and the weight of the forest pressing in around her. She stood frozen for a moment longer, then shook her head and forced a shaky laugh. "You're losing it, Emily, completely losing it." But as she turned to walk away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was laughing back at her. The air grew colder, biting into Emily's skin like needles. She tugged her jacket tighter, but no amount of layers could fight off the unnatural chill that seeped through her clothes and settled into her bones. It wasn't just the cold, it was the way it crept up suddenly, without warning, like a phantom brushing past her. She paused mid-step, her breath clouding the air in short, shallow bursts. The temperature drop didn't make sense. Not here, not now. Something was off. She scanned her surroundings, the flashlight in her trembling hand cutting through the dense fog. Shadows danced in the distance, warped and twisted by the mist. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure. A tall, skeletal silhouette that stood unnaturally still. She blinked, shaking her head. When she looked again, it was gone. "You're imagining things," she muttered under her breath, trying to laugh it off. But the laugh came out hollow, forced, and she couldn't ignore the prickling sensation creeping up her neck, as if unseen eyes were locked on her. Suddenly, a sharp rustling sound shattered the silence. Emily spun around, the beam of her flashlight jerking wildly across the trees. A pair of glowing eyes reflected back at her. Her heart leapt into her throat as she stumbled back. But then she saw it. A deer, standing deathly still. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, letting out a shaky breath. But as she stepped closer, her relief turned to unease. The deer didn't move. Its eyes didn't blink. And something about the way it stood, rigid, unnatural, made her stomach churn. "What's wrong with you?" she murmured, tilting her head. The deer's head twitched sharply, snapping toward her like a broken marionette. Emily yelped, stumbling back as the deer let out a low, guttural sound. Not a bleat, but something darker, something that didn't belong. Before she could react, it bolted into the trees, vanishing into the shadows. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stood frozen in place. She wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to the stress, the exhaustion, or the eerie atmosphere of the forest. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something terribly wrong. That's when she heard it. A low whisper, carried on the icy wind. Not a voice exactly, but a sound that seemed to slide into her ears and curl around her mind. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. "Emily!" She froze. The sound of her name shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. "You're losing it," she said aloud, her voice trembling as she tried to convince herself. "You're just tired." But the locals' warnings echoed in her mind, unbidden. The Wendigo. She had laughed it off, rolling her eyes at their hushed voices and grim expressions. "It's just a story," she had told them. "Legends to scare kids." But now, standing alone in the oppressive silence of the forest, their words felt heavier. "It's a malevolent spirit," the old man had said, his voice low and serious. "It hunts those who wander too far. It possesses the desperate, the lost." Emily had scoffed then, but now she wasn't so sure. The cold spots, the distorted shadows, the strange behavior of the deer, it all felt wrong. Another whisper drifted through the air, this one sharper, closer. She spun around, her flashlight beam shaking as it searched the darkness. "Who's there?" she yelled, her voice cracking. No response. Just the whisper of the wind and the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, her voice shaking. She forced her legs to move, trudging forward, but every step felt heavier, like the forest itself was trying to hold her back. And then she saw it. Another shadow, taller this time, impossibly thin, its limbs long and jagged. It stood at the edge of her flashlight's reach, just close enough for her to make out its distorted shape. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. Emily's heart pounded as she took a step back. The shadow shifted, but not like a person. It seemed to dissolve into the fog, vanishing before her eyes. Emily stumbled back, her mind racing. She didn't believe in legends. She didn't believe in spirits. But she couldn't deny it anymore. Something was out there, and whatever it wasn't human. The storm arrived suddenly, like a beast roaring to life. Thunder cracked across the sky, shaking the very ground beneath Emily's boots. The wind howled through the trees, twisting the branches into claw-like shapes that seemed to reach out toward her. Sheets of freezing rain lashed against her face, and the temperature plummeted with every passing second. "Damn it," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the storm's fury. Her flashlight flickered, its beam struggling to cut through the torrential downpour and thick fog. She cursed under her breath, scanning the area for any kind of shelter. The forest was no longer just a maze of trees. It was a trap, cold and uncaring, ready to swallow her whole. That's when she saw it. An old, crumbling cabin half hidden in the shadows of the trees. The roof sagged under years of decay, and the windows were dark, like hollow eyes watching her approach. It wasn't safe. It didn't look safe, but in that moment, it was her only option. "Better than freezing to death out here," she whispered, trying to convince herself. She bolted for the door, her boots slipping on the wet ground. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence of the cabin. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of rot and damp wood. She slammed the door shut behind her, leaning against it as she caught her breath. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a pack of wolves. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice shaking but determined. "Just wait it out. The storm will pass. It's fine. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. The darkness inside the cabin felt oppressive, like it was pressing down on her chest. Her flashlight beam darted around the room, illuminating broken furniture, shattered glass, and walls marked with deep, jagged scratches. "What the hell happened here?" she murmured, stepping carefully over the debris. The floor creaked under her weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. And then she saw it. Outside the cracked window, just beyond the edge of the trees, a shadow moved. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks on her, but then it moved again. A tall, unnaturally thin figure emerged from the fog, its silhouette barely visible against the stormy night. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's just the trees. It's nothing." The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the window, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. No response. But then its eyes appeared, two glowing orbs, burning with an unnatural, malevolent light. They locked onto her, unblinking, and a wave of cold terror swept over her. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, tears stinging her eyes. "It can't be real." The shadow moved closer, the glow of its eyes intensifying. It was still outside, but the way it moved, silent, deliberate, made her stomach twist with dread. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. What was it? What could it be? The storm screamed outside, but it couldn't drown out the sound of her own racing heartbeat. The figure stopped just at the edge of the tree line, its tall frame looming like a dark omen. Emily couldn't tear her eyes away, and then it started moving again, closer, faster. "No, no, no," she cried, fumbling for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hands found a rusted iron rod among the debris, and she gripped it tightly, her knuckles white. The figure reached the cabin now, its glowing eyes shining through the cracks in the walls. The cabin seemed to groan under the weight of its presence, the wood creaking and splintering as the shadow pressed closer. "Stay back!" Emily screamed, holding the rod out in front of her like a talisman. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't stop whatever was out there. A loud crash echoed through the cabin as the wind slammed into the door. The shadow's outline loomed larger, the glowing eyes burning brighter, and Emily felt her courage faltering. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, just go away." But the shadow didn't listen. It never did. The storm had subsided, but the silence that followed was far more terrifying. Emily's breaths came in short, ragged gasps as she stumbled through the dense forest, her legs screaming in protest with every step. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, and the faint glow of moonlight barely pierced through the heavy canopy above. But it wasn't the darkness or the cold that made her heart pound. It was the feeling, the undeniable, suffocating feeling, that she was being watched. Her flashlight flickered again, the weak beam casting erratic shadows on the forest floor. Every time the light wavered, she imagined something moving just beyond its reach. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay calm. "It's nothing, just the wind, just my imagination," she whispered to herself, though even she didn't believe the words anymore. A low sound drifted through the trees, chilling her to the core. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal, it was something else. A voice. "Emily." She froze, her entire body locking up as the sound wrapped around her like a cold embrace. It wasn't possible. No one knew she was here, and yet the voice had spoken her name, soft, drawn out, like a cruel mockery. "Who's there?" she yelled, her voice trembling as she swung the flashlight toward the source of the sound. The beam caught nothing but trees and mist. "Emily!" This time, it came from her right. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The voice was wrong. Too soft, too familiar, but distorted, like it was coming from underwater. "Stop it!" she screamed, clutching her flashlight so tightly her knuckles turned white. The woods answered with silence. And then she saw it. A shape emerged from the fog, tall and skeletal, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its skin clung to its bones like wet paper, and its glowing eyes burned with a hunger that made her stomach churn. The Wendigo. "Oh my God!" she breathed, stumbling backward. The creature didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her, its head tilting ever so slightly to the side. Its presence was overwhelming, a suffocating aura that made her legs feel like jelly. She turned and ran. Branches tore at her clothes and scratched her face as she sprinted through the forest, her lungs burning with every breath. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, treacherous, but she didn't dare slow down. She could hear it behind her now, the soft crunch of snow, the creak of its bones as it moved. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. But the Wendigo didn't stop. It didn't have to. She tripped over a root, crashing to the ground with a painful thud. Her flashlight flew from her hand, rolling a few feet away and casting a weak, sputtering light. Desperately, she crawled toward it, her hands shaking as she grabbed it and swung it around. The Wendigo was closer now. Its gaunt frame loomed over her, and she could see every horrifying detail. The sunken hollows where its cheeks should have been, the jagged teeth that filled its mouth, and the way its chest rose and fell with shallow, rasping breaths. "Please, don't," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. The creature let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the air like distant thunder. It took a step forward, its elongated limbs moving with an unnatural grace. Emily scrambled backward, her flashlight shaking in her grip. Suddenly, the creature stopped. "Emily." The voice wasn't coming from the Wendigo, it was coming from the woods around her. A voice she recognized. "Dad?" she whispered, her heart sinking. But it couldn't be. Her father was dead. She had buried him years ago. The Wendigo tilted its head again, as if amused by her confusion. And then it spoke. Not with its mouth, but with the voice that echoed through the trees. "Come to me, Emily." She clamped her hands over her ears, shaking her head violently. "No, stop it." But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it drowned out every other sound. She got to her feet and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. The Wendigo didn't follow, not directly. Instead, its shadow stretched out before her, impossibly long, as if it were everywhere at once. The forest seemed to twist and shift around her, the trees closing in like a living trap. She couldn't tell which way she was going anymore. Left, right, forward. It all looked the same. "No escape," the voice whispered, and she realized with dawning horror that it wasn't just the Wendigo's voice anymore. It was hers. It was everyone she had ever known, distorted and twisted into a mocking chorus. The Wendigo's hunger wasn't just for flesh, it was for despair, for fear. And with every step she took, every breath she struggled to draw, its power grew stronger. Emily's breath was shallow, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The forest felt like a cage, the trees pressing in on her from all sides, the shadows creeping closer with every step she took. She had to know the truth. She had to understand what this thing was that hunted her with such relentless hunger. She found him. The old man. The one who had survived when others hadn't. His cabin was small, tucked away behind a veil of mist, the wood rotting with age. He had been living alone for years, a hermit shrouded in mystery. Emily knew he had answers. Answers she needed. The man was sitting by the fire when she entered, his eyes glinting in the dim light, his face gaunt and pale, as if he had seen too much of the dark side of the world. "You've come for answers," he rasped, his voice cracked like dry leaves underfoot. "I can see it in your eyes." Emily nodded, her heart pounding. "Please, tell me what's happening. What is this thing? What is hunting me?" The man sighed, a long, heavy breath that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 nightmares. He leaned forward, his hands shaking as they hovered over the fire. "The Wendigo," he began slowly, the name itself making the air feel colder. "It is not just a creature. It's a curse that never ends." Emily's stomach turned as she sat down across from him, her eyes fixed on his every word. "It feeds on the desperate, on those who turn to darkness to survive. It doesn't care if you're good or evil. It doesn't care if you're human. It only cares about the hunger that never ends." He paused, looking into the flames as though seeing something far beyond them. "Years ago, there was a man, just like you, young, strong, full of life. His voice faltered. But the winter, the cold, it drove him to madness, and he did the unthinkable. He killed his own people to survive. Emily's eyes widened. He killed them? The old man nodded grimly. He ate them. He didn't care. The hunger. It took him. It consumed him. And when the storm passed, the man was gone. In his place was something else, something twisted, something hungry, the Wendigo. The fire crackled in the silence, its flames dancing in the dim room as the truth settled like a heavy weight on Emily's chest. "But that's not all," the old man continued, his voice barely a whisper now. "The curse, it's eternal. No one who becomes the Wendigo can ever escape. They will always hunger. They will always seek. Only the bravest, or the foolish, ever manage to break free, and even then they pay the price." Emily's mind raced. She thought of the Wendigo outside, its glowing eyes burning into her soul, the way it had followed her, mimicking voices, stalking her in the dark. It was him, the man, now nothing more than a twisted shadow of his former self. "How do I stop it?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "How do I break the curse?" The old man's eyes darkened. "You can't. Not alone. You can run, but it will always be there. You can fight, but it will always come back. The only way to break the curse is to destroy the Wendigo's heart. But no one who has ever tried has survived." Emily stood up abruptly, her blood running cold. "Then what am I supposed to do?" The old man's eyes met hers, his expression grim. "You have one choice now. You face it, you fight it, or you die running, but there's no escape, not for you, not for anyone who comes here." Emily's pulse quickened. She had no choice now. The Wendigo was out there waiting, hunting, and she wasn't going to let it win. Her eyes locked with the old man's. "I'll fight." He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Then remember this. The Wendigo isn't just a creature. It's the hunger, the fear, the desperation. You can kill the beast, but you can never kill the curse. It will always be there, in your mind, in your soul, always hungering." Emily didn't respond. She didn't need to. She could feel it already. The Wendigo was close. Its shadow stretched across the walls, its hunger calling to her. "No more running," she whispered. "I face it now." And as she stepped out into the night, the storm began again. But this time, the cold wasn't just the wind. It was the Wendigo's touch, reaching for her. A touch that promised only hunger. The storm had become a monster of its own, howling and raking through the forest with a fury that matched the madness in Emily's chest. She had no idea how long she had been running, no idea where she was anymore. The trees all looked the same, the wind the same, and through it all she could hear it, the unmistakable, bone-chilling sound of the Wendigo's growl. Closer. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as her boots slid through the icy snow, her fingers numb from the cold. The Wendigo was close, too close. Its footsteps, if they could even be called that, were silent but heavy, like the weight of the darkness itself following her. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as she stumbled into a small clearing. The moonlight barely broke through the thick clouds, casting the ground in a faint, eerie glow. And then she saw it. The Wendigo. It stood there, its skeletal form towering over her, eyes glowing like twin embers in the darkness. Its twisted grin stretched impossibly wide, the air around it thick with hunger. It stepped forward, the sound of its bones cracking with every movement sending shivers down her spine. "It's over," the Wendigo whispered, its voice impossibly low, like a growl woven into a human hiss. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, desperation flooding her veins. There was no running now, no more hiding. She had no weapon, no escape route. The only thing she had was what she had discovered earlier, a relic hidden deep in the woods, something the locals had mentioned in their cryptic warnings. A talisman, old as the forest itself. But it was far. Too far. The Wendigo took another step. Its hunger had a face now, hers. Think, Emily, think. Her eyes darted to the ground, and she saw it. The talisman. The relic that could repel the Wendigo, but she was too far away. Her mind raced. There was no time. She looked back at the Wendigo, and its glowing eyes locked with hers, a twisted smile creeping across its skeletal face. It was mocking her, taunting her. It was almost as if it knew she was about to make her last move. But Emily wasn't about to die like this. Not today. With a burst of adrenaline, she turned and ran toward the clearing. She could feel the Wendigo's presence closing in, like an insidious shadow growing larger. But the talisman, it was her only chance. She reached it just as the Wendigo lunged, its claws tearing through the air, swiping at her with blinding speed. Emily dove for the talisman, her fingers grazing the cold stone just in time as the Wendigo's hand swiped across her back, ripping through her jacket. Pain exploded in her spine, but she didn't stop. Grabbing the talisman, she rolled to her feet, her heart racing, the sound of the Wendigo's growl reverberating in her skull. She raised it high. She could feel its power, ancient and fierce, running through her as the Wendigo froze, its twisted face contorting in confusion and fury. "No," the Wendigo hissed. "You cannot." But it was too late. The talisman began to glow, a bright, blinding light that pulsed with a force so intense it felt like the earth itself was shaking. Emily screamed as the light expanded, engulfing the Wendigo in its blinding radiance. The creature shrieked, a horrible, guttural sound that ripped through the night. Its body convulsed and twisted, its form collapsing in on itself like a dying star. And then it was gone. Silence fell over the clearing, thick and suffocating. Emily's breath was ragged, the pain from the Wendigo's strike still coursing through her. Her legs buckled beneath her as the light from the talisman flickered out, leaving her in the cold dark once more. She didn't know if the Wendigo was truly gone or if it had just retreated. She didn't know if she had won, but she was alive. For now. The woods were quiet again, but deep in the shadows, a faint whispering voice called out, carrying a promise of things yet to come. Emily looked around, her heart racing once again, but there was nothing. No Wendigo, not yet. Her legs shook as she stood up, the weight of the night sinking in. She had survived, but at what cost? The curse, she knew, was far from over. The Wendigo might have been driven back, but its hunger would never cease. It would always be waiting. But for tonight, Emily had won. The wind had died down, and the storm was nothing more than a whisper in the distance. Emily stood at the edge of the forest, her body trembling from the cold and the terror that had consumed her for so long. The Wendigo was gone. Or so she thought. She had survived. By some miracle, she had escaped, her breath ragged as she stumbled toward the nearest village, the forest behind her a dark, silent void. She could still feel the weight of the Wendigo's presence, its hunger, its twisted gaze, its relentless pursuit. She had faced it, fought it, and emerged, alive. But it wasn't over. As the town lights flickered in the distance, Emily collapsed to her knees, her body finally giving way to exhaustion. She had made it out, but the curse, the hunger, was still with her. She could feel it, gnawing at her from the inside. Her skin tingled. A cold, creeping sensation crawled up her spine, just like the night the Wendigo had stalked her. She heard it, the faintest of whispers, distant and haunting, like a memory long forgotten. "You are mine," it seemed to say, a voice that echoed deep within her bones. Emily shook her head, her pulse quickening. She stood up, her legs shaky beneath her. Number. She had defeated it. She had survived. But as she took another step forward, something in her vision flickered, a shadow moving just out of the corner of her eye. She turned, her breath catching in her throat. The forest stood still, silent, but it wasn't empty. Number. She could feel it, something watching her, something waiting. Her heart raced. Then a strange sensation gripped her chest, like a hand, cold and unseen, had wrapped around her heart. The hunger, the hunger. It was inside her now. "No!" Emily cried, clenching her fists. She could feel the Wendigo's presence crawling beneath her skin, twisting her thoughts, urging her to give in, to feed. She gasped, fighting against the darkness trying to take hold of her. But the whispers, oh, the whispers, they were louder now, more insistent. "You cannot escape it," the voice hissed. "You are one of us now." Emily stumbled backward, a cold sweat breaking out across her brow. Her vision blurred. She looked down at her hands. Number. They were shaking, but it wasn't fear, it was something darker, something primal. "It's too late," she whispered to herself, her voice cracking with realization. She could feel the Wendigo's curse pulling at her, like invisible strings wrapping tighter and tighter around her soul. She had thought she was free, but the truth was more terrifying than she could have imagined. The Wendigo had never really left. It had marked her, and now she would carry its hunger with her, forever. The lights from the town grew dim, flickering once more, and the whispers became more than a sound. They were a promise, a curse, a warning, and deep inside her she knew. The Wendigo wasn't finished with her yet. It would wait. It would always wait. Emily took a trembling step forward, but in the back of her mind she could feel the Wendigo's shadow stretching out after her, its hunger never fully sated. As she walked toward the village, she heard one last thing before the world went dark. "You'll never escape," it said, the voice fading, but not entirely gone. Not yet. And in that moment Emily realized she had become a part of the story now. And the Wendigo's story? It was far from over.